Welcome to the Holistic Matters podcast, sponsored by Standard Process. Standard Process is a trusted brand at the forefront of high-quality, whole food-based nutritional supplements. Visit holisticmatters.com for a wide range of holistic health content, including articles, videos, continuing education, and more to keep you up to date on the latest nutrition science and herbal health trends. I'm today's host, Dr. Sarah Clarke, chiropractor, functional medicine practitioner, and Standard Process clinical educator. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Holistic Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Clarke, and I'm so excited to introduce you to my very special guest today, Alexis Schultz. Alexis is a research scientist at Standard Process, and she works at the farm in Wisconsin and is instrumental in both crop development and research. We're so lucky to have her here chatting with us today to teach us all about organic farming, regenerative agricultural processes, and why soil diversity is so crucial for overall health. So thanks so much for being here, Alexis.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So thanks for spending your busy days with us, but I would love to just start and really give our listeners more information about how significant soil health really is. I think we all know about the importance of nutrient-dense foods, but personally, I can feel a little bit removed from the soil. Like I'm not in contact with farming on a regular basis, so I think some of our healthcare practitioners might feel the same way. We all know about whole foods being so important in our diet, but the majority of us, of course, get it from the grocery store and maybe if we're lucky, a farmer's market. So I'd love to just hear more about your point of view on what constitutes healthy soil and how it affects our crops and in turn our health.
Yeah, so as an organic farm, which Standard Process is, we do really have to rely on our soil and having healthy soil to produce those nutrient-dense and resilient crops that we're growing for our supplements. Since we're organic, we can't rely on synthetic like herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, or anything like that to kind of help our plants grow and thrive. So they really have to be resilient on their own and tackle everything that Mother Nature throws at them. And a lot of that starts in the soil. So while healthy soil is kind of a concept that's hard to quantify or put numbers or data to, there's a lot of research going on around the ag and soil community on that. But we do know that there's a few signs of healthy soil, and that's kind of what we're focusing on. So organic matter is kind of a really good starting point and incredibly important to soil, which is determined not only by the soil type of the field, but also the management practices that a farm might practice. Organic matter is a great source of food for the microorganisms that are living in the soil. And these microorganisms play a really important role in soil by governing the nutrient breakdown process and recycling because they break down this organic matter that we're adding to the soil and make the nutrients available for the plants to then take up. They also can affect the soil structure by forming aggregates, which is basically just clumps of soil, simple way to put it. And this really helps with water infiltration, especially here in Wisconsin this past week. We got over 4 inches of rain in a very short period of time. So having healthy soil really helps to get that water moving so it's not standing, because standing water is pretty bad for crops, cutting off all the oxygen for them. Back to nutrients though, when we work in cover crops to a field or apply manure or any type of compost, that organic form of nutrients isn't actually available for plants to take up. So we have to rely on those microbes to decompose that organic matter and make it into a more simple inorganic form, which then plant roots can take up. To go a little bit more in depth in soil science, organic matter also is going to increase your cation exchange capacity, or your CEC. And this just means that decomposed organic matter actually has a lot of negative charge to it. And a lot of your nutrients are positively charged. So that soil is able to hold on to those nutrients for longer and reduces the amount of leaching that happens where nutrients might be leaching out of the soil. So it's better at holding on to those nutrients, and then it slowly makes them available for plants as it's gradually released while microbes are doing their thing in the soil to help the plants out.
That is great to know. I think there are so many facets into what you just talked about. So we're probably just really scratching the surface with this conversation today. But one of the things I took away from what you said was that these microbes can really impact the plants, which then, of course, in turn influence our bodies. And I think most practitioners are aware of the importance of the gut microbiome and the various microbiomes that the human body has and the importance of just keeping them in balance. So can you tell us more about how each crop actually has its own unique microbiome? And I guess what impact does that have on the soil too?
Yeah, so it's a really cool relation. Just like our guts, each plant kind of has its own microbiome. And similar to our gut and what like our practitioners know about gut health is it's super important to have that diversity in your gut for a healthy microbiome. Different types of plants actually have different organisms living on their roots to form their microbiome. And this microbiome has evolved with these plants over centuries and kind of developed a symbiotic relationship. So they rely on the plants to survive and in return provide benefits to the plant. So the roots of a plant actually exude a complex mixture of organic compounds, which provides the food for the microorganisms. And then the contents of that root exudate and also just the amount of it really depends on the type of plant. Different microorganisms obviously have different food sources or food preferences that they want. So this kind of shows why diversity is important because you're going to get a different type of microbiome depending on the crops that you have in your field. In return for food, organisms in the rhizosphere, and the rhizosphere is the really small area of the soil around the root, only about 4 millimeters around the root, help stimulate plant growth through hormones, breakdown of toxins. They increase the nutrient availability, which I kind of talked about, build those soil aggregates, and also have the potential to suppress harmful organisms because there are those harmful bacteria or fungi in some cases, which is where you might see diseases. A little fun fact, millions of soil microorganisms in only a gram of soil. It's really hard to kind of wrap your brain around that, but there's a lot going on below our feet. And this includes everything from bacteria to fungi to protozoa, nematodes, and a lot more. In that rhizosphere is where the richest area of those microorganisms, and there's actually 1,000 times more microorganisms in the rhizosphere compared to the soil right next to it or farther away from the root, just because there's all that interaction going on right around the root. Another really important role is that there actually are bacteria that live in nodules of legume crops. And these are your different types of beans, your peas, your alfalfa, couple other ones. And these bacteria actually have the ability to convert atmospheric nitrogen, which is unavailable to plants, into a usable form of nitrogen that the plants and subsequent crops can then take up, which I think is really cool.
That is amazing. I think you probably blew my mind and everyone's mind listening because there's so much going on that we can't even see, that we're not thinking about. And it sounds like depending on where the soil is located, where the farm is, how it is being taken care of, all of these factors are going to influence what's going on, the diversity, like you talked about. I can just really see that connection too between the microbial diversity making an influence in soil health, just like how in our own gut microbiomes, the diversity plays a huge role. And it can really impact all of our body systems, just like how you're talking about with the soil. So I love that connection. So thanks for telling us all about that. In terms of specific ways to keep the soil healthy, I don't think most healthcare practitioners are really familiar with the intricacies of regenerative farming practices, organic practices like the ones that you're talking about here. So these are probably second nature to you, but I would love if you could just give us a little bit more information about something like crop rotation. I guess, how does it work and how does that support healthy soil?
Yeah, so crop rotation is exactly what it sounds like. It's rotating the crop or even like the family of crops that are grown in a certain field every year. So here in Wisconsin, we have a relatively short growing season compared to a lot of other places. So we're only really able to grow things late spring into fall. That's our kind of typical growing season. But there are ways that we can rotate a couple more crops in there. In the Midwest, especially what we call the Corn Belt, it is very common for farmers to just switch back and forth between corn or soybeans. So if you've ever taken a trip through the Midwest, you're probably driving past either corn or soybeans. And that's just because that's what we have the infrastructure and market for here in the Midwest. At Standard Process, we have a bit of a different story, and we're incredibly lucky that we have a lot of different crops that we use in our supplements and that we have to grow every year. So this makes it a lot easier for us to have more diversity in our crop rotation. This year alone, I just counted, we have 17 different crops that we have to grow, and that's before we even count the cover crop mixes, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But some benefits of crop rotation are a natural way for us to kind of prevent disease and insects, since both of these things are usually specialized on either a specific crop or family of crops, like I said. If you switch up the crop that you're growing in that same field, you're kind of taking away their home and food source, which makes them less likely to stick around year to year. So it's a natural way to combat some of those disease and pest pressures. It also helps with weed pressure, since different crops are managed in different ways. So some crops are actually better at suppressing and competing against weeds, like buckwheat, because it's a very fast growing crop and outcompetes weeds pretty well by cutting off the sunlight that those weeds can get to. Or other crops like our transplants go through a little bit more of mechanical weed removal, which takes the weed pressure off for future crops in that same field. By switching it up every season, or even a couple different crops per season, we're able to combat some of those things that farmers have to deal with.
Interesting. So basically, instead of using something like synthetic pesticides, cover cropping could even be a use, like you said, to kind of mitigate that.
Yep.
I was thinking about it more for soil health, but that's really interesting that it is used in that way. Thanks for talking about that. And I know when you and I had talked previously, we kind of talked about how cover cropping itself can improve the diversity of the root system too. So it can even like go even deeper. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about that? I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. And just going back to our previous topic, crop rotation also definitely helps with soil health, because you are diversifying the crops that are growing and switching up the microbe communities. So that's also a great point that you bring. Cover crops, I love cover crops. I could talk about them for a very long time. Essentially what they are crops that are grown with no intention of being harvested. The point of growing them is to benefit the soil and any future crops that will be grown in that field. Cover crops can be grown kind of in the off season. So aside from that growing season that I talked about here in Wisconsin, essentially whenever the primary crop that you're growing is not in the field. Benefits of cover crops include reducing erosion, because you have a cover over your soil that protects the soil from rain or wind erosion, and reduces weed pressure, kind of how I said how buckwheat is really good at competing against weeds, and also improves the soil health by increasing organic matter, which we had talked about, and diversifying that microbe community. Also, just by having those living roots in the soil has a lot of benefits to prevent erosion, break up compaction, and also goes back to those microbes and giving them some food source throughout the year when we might not have our primary crop in the ground. So often when we use a cover crop, we are using a cover crop mix, kind of ideal. And this just means that there's different types of plants that we have mix all the seed together and plant it. And this is beneficial because different crops bring different benefits to the soil. So for example, we had talked about how those legumes are fixing nitrogen, or the bacteria in the legumes, from atmospheric nitrogen and making it available for future crops to use. On the other hand, grasses have a more fibrous root system, which provide their own benefits to the soil, but they also are very fast growing and they have a lot of biomass above the soil. So when those get worked into the ground later in the season, you're putting a lot more organic matter back into the ground. So having living roots in the soil, like I said, kind of year round, or more often than just that primary crop, is providing that food system for beneficial microbes even in the off season, and really just keeping them happy and keeping your microbe community very diverse and well established.
We want those healthy and happy plants, right?
Yes, we do.
Need to keep them happy. But can we think of this cover cropping period almost as like a rest period? I know there's a lot of like activity, it sounds like, going on, but is it kind of a time for that area to like rest and rejuvenate?
Yeah, obviously there's a lot going on below ground, but you don't really see that. But above ground, instead of us cultivating it, controlling weeds, making multiple passes, we basically let the field rest until we go back and then work it in after that season is over.
Another topic that I think is probably like gaining a little bit more traction now is composting. So it's something that I wanted to talk to you about. I know growing up, specifically in my house, we had compost bins, and I didn't really understand the extent that it really like helped enrich the soil. But could you give us a little insight into what the process looks like on the farm and maybe how it works?
Yeah, so at Standard Process, we basically have a very large scale version of the compost bin that you had growing up. All of our crops that we press for juice, which is quite a few of them on a yearly basis, They produce a pulp, which is kind of the byproduct that we end up not using. And all of this pulp is then trucked with a dump truck out to our compost pile, which we have on the farm. Dump trucks are taking this pulp out to the compost site and then dumping them into these very long piles. If you ever come on a tour at Standard Process, you can actually see them. We try to make it a point to go past the compost. And these piles have to be turned or essentially just mixed up about once or twice a week to maintain the temperature that we have to, by regulation, keep the compost at. And that's between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. This allows the microbes in it to still thrive, but it also allows us to kill off if there's any weed seeds or stuff that we don't want in there. It helps us as basically a kill step. These piles are produced and maintained throughout the spring and summer and even a little bit in early fall as we're harvesting all the crops here at Standard Process and pressing those for juice. And then in the fall or later in the fall, after they've been breaking down for a while, they've been maintained and turned, they are then spread back onto our fields. There is variation year to year of how much compost we're able to produce, but on average, it's roughly 400 tons of compost every year. And this is just a really great way to return some of those nutrients and organic matter back into the soil, because when you harvest a crop, you're removing a lot of that biomass, and this is a great way to return something after you've taken a lot out of the soil.
We'd like to take a quick moment to mention our sponsor, Standard Process. Standard Process, a family-owned company, makes high-quality, whole food-based nutritional supplements. Standard Process was a pioneer in whole food nutrition. Many of the ingredients used in the company's whole food-based supplements are grown on-site on their 850-acre certified organic farm. They're passionate about cultivating nutrient-dense soil, which maximizes the nutrient density of the plants that end up in their products. Standard Process is inspiring a new era of whole food nutrition innovation that remains dedicated to your practice, your patients, and your health. To learn more about Standard Process, visit standardprocess.com/only@sp.
Yeah, wow. I can't get over the 400 tons personally. Because I think when we think about that, I mean, that is the weight of 4 blue whales. We can think about it that way, or 80 elephants. So that is in and of itself probably a huge feat to manage on a farm. So I totally understand how, in terms of organic farming, that's just a whole like extra step that people have to do to maintain the soil. So really interesting. Are these processes, the cover cropping and the compost, are these processes that all organic farms have to participate in? I know organic is so important. And so I'm just curious, like, how prevalent are organic farms in the United States? Are they pretty rare? Or can you give us a little insight into what that looks like?
Yeah, I've never heard anyone compare the amount of compost to blue whales or elephants, but I might have to use that as like a fun fact for the future. So in order to maintain our certified organic status at Standard Process, there are rules and guidelines that we do have to follow. And we also have an annual inspection that we have to pass every year. So some of these guidelines include things like crop rotation, planting organic seed as long as there's enough available, maintaining buffer strips between us and our neighbors to kind of reduce the amount of risk, whatever our non-organic neighbors are doing with their fields, and also not using any GMOs. So those are just a couple of the organic guidelines that we do have to follow to make sure that we're staying compliant, and we take that very seriously. So when you talk about numbers, I had to look these up. The USDA reported back in 2021, when they had one of their last surveys, that there were 17,445 certified organic farms covering about 4.9 million acres in the US. Wisconsin is actually 7th in organic sales, but 2nd for the number of organic farms, and that's as recent as 2022. So the average organic farm in Wisconsin is actually only 169 acres. I'm sure you're going to point out, Sarah, is well below the amount of acres that we're currently farming here in Palmyra.
Yeah, that's amazing. So if the average is 169, I think we're even over 870 organic acres now. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's amazing. That's a lot more than average. If anyone's ever been to the farm, it's amazing. It's beautiful. There's a lot to see, and it has a whole energy of its own. It's a really special place. And I kind of wanted to switch gears now and hear more about one of your specialties, actually, which is plant breeding, which is a whole area that a lot of us don't know a lot about. It sounds fascinating, but can you talk a little bit about what even plant breeding is and how it supports an organic farm system?
Some of the basic levels of plant breeding, you're right, it is a passion and an area of expertise of mine. I know plant breeding can be a very scary term to someone who might not be familiar with agriculture, or even confusing, because I just said that to follow organic compliance, we can't use any GMOs. And I think sometimes when people hear plant breeding, they automatically think of genetic modification or GMOs. GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, just to be clear, are just a tool that plant breeders can use in the plant breeding industry, but they're not a tool that we're allowed to use or that we use in the organic setting. So plant breeding is still incredibly important to organic production and farming in general. We wouldn't be where we are just in agriculture in general if it weren't for plant breeding. If we talk about just the basics, plant breeding and plant selection have been a tool used by farmers forever, essentially, or for a very long time, long before plant breeding was even a term or something that you could go to school for. So farmers would save seed out of their farms or their gardens of their highest performing plants, because it just makes sense, right? If you had a really high performing plant, you were going to save some of that seed, so then you could plant it the next year because you knew it did well on your farm and in your climate. So this is a very early example of what making selections look like. And then as time went on and our technology got more advanced and we learned more, we have been able to make crosses to create hybrids, speed up variety development, overall just really increase yield and make farming more sustainable and efficient with simply the genetics of the crops that we're planting on our farm. So historically, plant breeders have been focused on developing varieties that will increase yields, since that's how they were going to feed a growing population, and also farmers are getting paid based on how much that they can produce. So yields are very important. But this might have looked like selecting for crops that had higher productivity traits, made processing a little bit easier, were disease or pest resistant, had a certain flavor profile, maybe a little sweeter when we look at some of our fruits, or a little less bitter when it comes to some of the vegetables that consumers eat or fill their plates with on a daily basis, and also shelf life. And just overall, you want your crops to look good, right? Everyone wants that beautiful apple that's red, no blemishes. So those are the kind of things that plant breeders were focused on for most of the time. It's what consumers drove, what consumers wanted, and what would make farmers a profit at the end of the day. So nutrients were not really paid as much attention to. So just naturally, they were something that kind of fell off and became a little more diluted as we narrowed down that gene pool after years and years of selecting and tailoring it to the more efficient crops, or the crops that produce more.
So interesting. There's a lot that goes into it. Hopefully we are focusing now more on the nutrient density rather than like the Instagram perfect apple like you're talking about. We have to get our priorities straight. But with that whole background of plant breeding, can you tell us a little bit more about ancient oats? I know that's a plant that you work with often on the farm. Is there a connection there? And would love to hear kind of more about that.
Yeah, so oats are a great example of how crops have changed over time, and also tell the story of what makes standard process unique and how we are doing things differently here. Oats have been cultivated for centuries. They actually used to be a staple crop in a lot of people's diets because they were caloric and nutritionally dense and met all the needs that people would need. But over time, as plant breeders kind of got their hands on them, and as farmers were selecting the traits that were more beneficial to them, we now have that more plump, carb-heavy oat that you see in the grocery store, or when you buy your oatmeal flakes, they're nice and big flakes, right? But at standard process, we do use oats in some of our supplements, and we wanted to have our oats fit our story and our whole food idea and our nutrient density a little bit better. So we actually set out to work with a plant breeding company to develop our own line of oat. And how we did that was looked back at some of the ancient varieties of oats, or those varieties that were people's main food source centuries ago. And after a few years of selections and developments, we actually were able to develop our Royal Ancient Oat, which is super exciting. So we do own this variety of oat. It's ours, which also adds a layer of complexity, because not only do we have to produce enough of this oat then every year to fill all of the supplements that need them, but we also have to be our own seed supplier, because we can't just go out and buy this seed anywhere now or from any seed companies. That kind of just shows the amount of work that goes into a single ingredient or a single crop that we're growing here at the SP farm. What's really cool and what I mean by more nutrient dense, I say that a lot, to put some actual facts to it, is that this oat has a higher fiber, protein, and avenanthromide level than your more conventional plump carb-heavy oat. Some difficult things about it, though, are it is lower yielding than the oats that farmers are currently growing. And it also is a little bit harder to grow just with some lodging issues that we're having, and that it's a little tall and thinner. It looks a lot different. It almost looks more like a black rice grain than an actual oat. So it looks very different. So that means there's going to be some differences when it comes to growing it and processing it. At the end of the day, we are still very happy with our Royal Ancient Oat.
Wonderful. Wow. Thanks for that insight there. And it's interesting too, because in terms of diet, like theoretically, people could then consume these oats, like you said, get the benefits of the avenanthramides, and then also have that lower glycemic load with the higher fiber and protein content. So it kind of can change the impact that it has on the body and our blood glucose, which is super interesting. In terms of seed selection, I would love to kind of get into that. I know it's a little bit different topic, but I guess why do we need seed selection? Maybe if you could talk about like variety trials and what those are, why they're important, what does it entail?
Yeah, so with my background in plant breeding, variety trials are some of my favorite things that I get to do every summer out here at the farm. And for a lot of crops that we grow, there are multiple varieties available on the organic seed market and just the seed market in general. And there's always new varieties coming out. Since developing our own variety, as much as we would love to have our own variety of everything kind of tailored to our needs, it's a very long and expensive process, and that it's really just not feasible to do to every crop that we grow. So we do conduct variety trials with a lot of different purchase seed to determine which varieties are going to grow best in our location here in southeastern Wisconsin on our organic farm, but also have that nutrient profile that we're looking for to provide a high quality crop and ingredient for our supplements. So I kind of mentioned earlier that organic crops have to be vigorous to outcompete weeds or any other challenges that Mother Nature is going to throw at it throughout its growing period. They don't get the help of the seed treatments that conventional seeds get, or the synthetic herbicides, fertilizers, or pesticides. So we have to make sure that we're selecting a variety that has those good genetics that are going to allow it to be vigorous and perform well on our standard process farm. So when we do variety trials, we then take it even a step further, not just how they're performing agronomically, which is like germination rates, germination time. They have to come out of the soil pretty fast and beat all those weeds, and just yield and how much biomass these crops are producing. But then we take it a step further and also evaluate for its nutrient profiles and make sure that we're growing the best choices for our supplements.
Wonderful. Thanks for answering that. And adding to the oats, I think another crop that we have that's amazing is mountain spinach. And what has your experience been like growing mountain spinach in the Wisconsin climate?
It has been quite the learning period, to kind of summarize the experience. So when our nutrition scientists or our research team down at the NIC finds a new crop that they think would be beneficial to our products, it often takes multiple years to figure out if it's feasible for us to grow here in Wisconsin and if we can successfully move forward with it and add that crop to our rotation. So with the mountain spinach, the farm team has gone through a lot of trial and error between planting times, planting methods, plant spacing, weeding methods, harvest times, varieties, and a couple other things to try to figure out the best way to grow it. And often, like I said, trial and error, you definitely learn from any failures involved. It's an important part in the research step. While we still have a lot to learn about it, we are able to successfully grow it now on our farm and provide it for our supplements. Always open to learning new things about it and kind of altering our methods as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. It is so beautiful. I got the chance to see it at the farm and it is just stunning. I was curious too, with the different varieties, if they do have slight color variations, is the brightest color actually the most nutritious, or what did you guys find with that?
Yeah, so I can't speak for all crops, but in the case of the mountain spinach, when we did a variety trial 2 years ago, we did find that the plant and the variety that produced that really bright red magenta color that we were looking for also had the highest level of those natural electrolytes that we also wanted to put into our whole food electrolyte products. In that case, yeah, the really bright color did align with those higher nutrient levels.
I can tell you're so passionate about this and that you know so much about the farm and everything that you do. Do you have a favorite aspect of working on the farm or with crops in general?
I love that everything that we do here in Standard Process with the research team is so different than your typical ag research setting. Everything from the varieties that we're growing to the time that we're harvesting the crops to just the type of crops that we grow, it's different, which makes everything super interesting. So there's so much variety in kind of like the day-to-day that I get to do. And there's no shortage for sure of things that I've learned since working here. And I also love that I have the opportunity to share our farm and agriculture in general with people who might be more disconnected from it or maybe haven't been out to our farm or to a farm in general. So it's especially fun to talk to people who are really interested in health and wellness, but might not have made that connection or fully understand how the plants and soil play a role in overall health and wellness and how it all really ties back to the soil and the seeds that we're planting.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for making that connection. And I just really appreciate you being here and sharing all of your wisdom and your expertise around soil health and organic farming practices. I think it's something that we can all learn more about. It's just really interesting to see that connection between the soil, the foods we're eating, and how it impacts our bodies. So personally, I can't wait to hear you talk more at the virtual symposium. So we are having a really special Whole Systems Nutrition virtual symposium on October 24th. And so our listeners can register for this event in our show notes. So go ahead and check out our show notes to find a link for it there. And it offers 6 continuing education credits as well. Just wanted to shout that out. Can't wait to hear you speak more in depth, Alexis, there. And thank you again for your time and for sharing so much valuable information with our listeners.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. I love chatting with you today.
Have a great one.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Tune in every first and third Thursday for new Holistic Matters episodes, and be sure to like and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Remember to visit holisticmatters.com for a wide range of holistic health content to keep you up to date on the latest nutrition science and herbal health trends. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. And a special thank you to our sponsors, Standard Process. Thank you for listening. Visit holisticmatters.com for more content. And remember, that's holistic with a W.